Welcome to ACE. This is a show where we explore the self-employed creative life and how to do your best work. How to make things happen, how to navigate all the stress and chaos and unknown of charting your own path. My name is Darren Joe. I'm your host. Thank you so much for listening. Has there ever been a situation in your creative life, in your business, where you come up against a roadblock and no amount of pushing and pulling and striving and trying and effort seems to do any good? You're just right back to where you started, like Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the mountain only to see that rock fall back down again? Well, maybe trying harder is not the answer. In fact, many of the greatest ancient Chinese thinkers believe that cultivating spontaneity was the most effective way to be in the world, was the source of all success. Well, that sounds great, but how can we do this? How can we cultivate spontaneity in our lives to do more and become more? Well, I'm so glad that I found the book of our next guest. It's called Trying Not to Try: Ancient China, Modern Science, and the Power of Spontaneity. It's intended to explain the thinking of some of the greatest ancient Chinese thinkers in a way that we can understand and apply to our lives. And more importantly, it's about trying not to try, and how cognitive science has really shed a lot more light on the power of the thoughts of these ancient Chinese thinkers. So the author of this book, Professor Edward Slingerland, is an internationally renowned expert in Chinese thought, comparative religion, and cognitive science. He's a professor of Asian studies and the Canada Research Chair in Chinese Thought and Embodied Cognition at the University of British Columbia. He was educated at Princeton, UC Berkeley, and Stanford, and he's also just a cool guy. And I love that he is merging these different fields. So yeah, I hope you enjoy our conversation and that you also cultivate the power of Wu-Wei, the power of spontaneity in your working lives. Here we go. Edward, welcome to ACE.
Thanks for having me.
So I just want to first just sincerely thank you for coming on the show. When I stumbled across your book, I was so excited because it's actually been the theme of this year for me, is this idea of trying not to try. So of course, I got the introduction off of Kindle. And then once I read what you were going to discuss in the book, I was like, I can't believe this book exists. So I devoured it in a couple weeks. And it's really helped me understand, that concept of trying not to try. And I can't wait to explore it further. Let me first ask you, how did you get into studying Asian languages? And then, moving into religious studies, what got you interested in those topics?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was a science major in my first 2 years of college. And that's what I did in high school, was mostly science. I read Zhuangzi. So I read, Taoist philosophy in translation as a teenager in high school. And I think I got into it through science fiction, which was kind of weird. Reconstructing it, I think Ursula Le Guin. So I was really into science fiction, and Left Hand of Darkness. She starts off each chapter with a quotation from either the Zhuangzi or the Laozi, the Tao Te Ching. So I think that's how I was sort of made aware of Taoism, early Taoism. So I knew I liked it and was interested in it. And at a certain point, I just realized in my college career that as much as I enjoyed the ideas of science, I didn't enjoy doing science professionally. As I started to actually do it, I was like, oh, actually doing science is kind of boring. There's a lot of math. It was measuring things. And so I had this kind of midlife crisis at age 20 where I dropped out of school and rode my motorcycle to California. And part of that was thinking, you know what, I'm going to do something completely different and be a Chinese major. Part of it, I think, too, is I was also way into Jack Kerouac. And on the road, it's Dharma Bums. There's a character named Jaffe who's modeled on Gary Snyder. So he's a grad student at Berkeley studying Chinese and Japanese classical poetry, and he's hangs out in the mountains and drinks wine and reads Zen poetry. And I thought, yeah, that's actually what I want to do for a living. So, yeah, it was a part of this just reorganization of my life that happened around age 20. And it was the best thing I ever did because it's beautiful material, and it ends up having connections with cognitive science. So I've actually, in this roundabout way, kind of come back to the sciences again.
As I was preparing for this podcast, I'm like, man, Edward is just so cool. He's you're like studying Asian languages, cognitive science, evolutionary psychology, like all these things. I thought we could first frame the conversation by a quote from your book, which really grabbed me. Our excessive focus in the modern world on the power of conscious thought and the benefits of willpower and self-control causes us to overlook the pervasive importance of what might be called body thinking, tacit, fast, and semi-automatic behavior that flows from the unconscious with little or no conscious interference. The result is that we too often devote ourselves to pushing harder or moving faster in areas of our life where effort and striving are, in fact, profoundly counterproductive. That's a very powerful thought, and I want to bring it up because so often in the world I live in, which is this world of entrepreneurship, solopreneurship, we never hear that. It's always about striving, pushing harder, like get up earlier, work harder, drink more protein shakes, go to the gym. And being a former athlete myself, having played tennis in college, I can totally relate to that. And you describe, human excellence as too often impoverished, cold, and bloodless, our modern conception of it. And that's exactly how I feel. But I'm so trapped in this narrative because I'm so used to that way of thinking of getting stuff done. And so, my question to you is, what inspired you to write this book? Because I know you've written a ton, in academic journals and more academic books. So why this one, Trying Not to Try?
Yeah, partly because my students really connected to these ideas. So I teach this big survey course in the Introduction to Early Chinese Philosophy that I actually now have a MOOC on the edX platform on the topic. I just found that students love these ideas, and often because they're cramming and pulling all-nighters, and they're puzzled why they're not getting the results they think they should be getting, or they're puzzled why they're unhappy or not creative. And I've had students come up to me after a lecture and be like, oh, I get it now. Like, there are certain goals that you just can't pursue directly. And trying harder in that situation actually not only doesn't help, it actually hurts. And so I did feel like these early Chinese thinkers had these insights into, they just had a different model. They had a different model of human perfection, right? So for the thinkers I look at, and this isn't true of all early Chinese thinkers, but the ones I focus on, the Taoists and the Confucians, they've got this, it's embodied, right? It's about a type of perfection that's not just intellectual understanding or self-control or willpower. It's about harmonizing your emotions, training your emotion in your body in a certain type of way that allows you to respond spontaneously but properly to situations. And that just struck me as such a more psychologically realistic model of what it means to be a good person, what it would mean to be a parent, or a good friend, that it's worth exploring how you attain this ideal, what are the tensions involved in attaining this ideal, and how it does provide this really alternate model of education and self-cultivation that we don't have, right? And it's, I'd argue that both this is because of this kind of philosophical hangover from the Enlightenment, where we inherited this disembodied model of the self, where, our bodies are just these containers for carrying around our brains, but really all we are is these minds. And then so it's all about the mind. So it's interesting. The reason I studied Chinese philosophy, because I was interested in Western philosophy in high school and early college. And there's actually a passage in Kant that when I look at now, I have a vivid memory of reading it and thinking, this is messed up. And that's one of the reasons I think I stopped studying Western philosophy. It's this passage in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals where he's talking about, he calls him the amiable person. But this is someone who just is kind of nice and sympathetic and takes genuine, internally rewarding pleasure in being kind and nice to other people. They just do it spontaneously. They do it sincerely. They don't have to think about it. They're just nice. And Kant says these people are okay, but they're not really moral. Because to be a true moral agent, you have to stop and think, does the categorical imperative require me to do this? And you have to answer yes. And then you have to force yourself you have to do it consciously and in a willed way, because otherwise it's just habit. So he has this distinction between doing something aus Neigung, out of inclination or habit, as opposed to aus Pflicht, out of duty, out of sense of the moral law. And it just seemed so bizarre to me, because I was like, I'd rather hang out with like the guy who's just naturally nice than the person who has to sit and think about the categorical imperative. And you can understand the philosophical reasons why he felt that way, but the fact that he comes down on that side struck me as the result of this really distorted model of what being a human is. And what's interesting is if you look at the early Confucian tradition, they're aware of this distinction as well. People who are kind of naturally spontaneously good, and then people have to stop, think about it, and force themselves to do the right thing. But they flip the valuation. So there's this interesting passage in the Xunzi, this Warring States Confucian text, where he's talking about the certain levels of people. He's working his way up, and basically the lowest level person is the person. Well, the lowest level person is bad, right? They know something's wrong, but they do it anyway because they can't control themselves. And the next level up is someone who's really Kant's ideal moral agent, someone who wants to do the bad thing or isn't inclined to do the good thing, but then thinks about it and says, "Oh, I really should," and forces himself to do it. That person's just okay for Xunzi. The ideal moral agent is someone who's so internally cultivated virtues and internalized the Confucian way that they just spontaneously and naturally do the right thing. And that's the highest level of moral attainment for the Confucians. So it's actually the opposite of Kant's evaluation. And I think I think it fits also better the way folk psychology works. So for instance, Kant also has a similar dichotomy when he's talking about this shopkeeper who's the honest shopkeeper, who doesn't cheat his customers because it just doesn't occur to him to cheat his customers. He's just naturally honest. And again, that's like a morally inferior. It's not properly moral. You have to choose to not, because you consult the moral law. But at the end of the day, I want to shop at a store. I want to shop at a store that's got a person who's spontaneously honest, right? They don't have to think about cheating me or not cheating me. And so this gets to this other part of the book. So the book's about the power of spontaneity. But then this idea of charisma or trust that you get when you have spontaneity. And I'm arguing the Chinese have a religious story about why the two go together, a kind of theological explanation. But I think you can tell a cognitive scientific evolutionary story about it, why these two things, spontaneity and charisma, hang together. And I think it's because we trust people who seem sincere and authentic and at peace with what they're doing. They don't have ulterior motives. They're not overthinking things. And there's really good evolutionary reasons why we'd be built that way, why we'd be worried, why we'd be suspicious if people have to think too much or who hesitate or have to, kind of think about why they would want to do something. We want to know that we have people who are watching our backs, and the people watching our backs are people who just are really there, right? They're not having to think about it. And so probably the most technical part of the book is where I look at some cooperation dilemmas in human societies. And I'm arguing that the reason we come to associate spontaneity with trust has to do with these cooperation dilemmas that you get when you start trying to cooperate with people who aren't genetically related to you and who you also can't track constantly. So, for most of our evolutionary history, we lived in these small scale societies where everyone was either related to us or we could kind of keep track of them. If they don't cooperate, we can not cooperate with them next time. But we live in societies now, large scale societies, where we're involved in these one-off interactions with strangers. And that creates entirely new cooperation problems that our Pleistocene brains don't have built-in mechanisms for dealing with.
Could you help set the stage for some of our listeners that aren't familiar with these ancient Chinese thinkers and kind of explain, the Warring States period that they emerged out of? And could you also just define like Wu-Wei and Da?
Yeah, and those were, one of the other reasons I wrote the book is I find that people who know me start using these terms all the time. And I think that's very revealing because they're clearly filling a gap in our vocabulary, right? So it's like Schadenfreude, right? Everyone experiences Schadenfreude, but the Germans do it more than anyone else, and so they have a word for it. But once we get that word, we can actually put a label on something that we experience, but we don't think about. And words are useful. So having a term for something, if you don't have a word for something, you often don't notice it. And so I think it's really helpful to have these new words because they actually focus your attention. You start to notice things you wouldn't notice otherwise. And so these are two Wu-Wei and Da, are these ideas that get developed in early Chinese thought. So Warring States period, roughly 6th to 3rd century BCE. China's divided, what we think of now as China is divided into these states that are warring with one another for supremacy. It's just a very creative period in Chinese philosophy because there was so much turmoil, but also, ability for people to move around. If you had ideas that weren't popular in the state you were in, you could just go to the next state. So, and there was also a marketplace for ideas because these rulers were all very eager to get an edge on their neighbor. And so they were open to hearing about new ways of organizing their state or thinking about morality or how to get people to be good. Rulers were establishing think tanks, actually, where people would come and debate. So it was a really interesting period. Two of the main schools that I talk about are loosely Confucians versus the Taoists. The Confucians are a self-identified school, so they're followers of Confucius. Taoist is a label that was invented later to refer to a couple thinkers or groups of thinkers in early China that had similarities. But the one thing that these two groups have in common is for both of them, the concepts of Wu-Wei and Da are very central. So Wu-Wei literally means no doing or non-action or not trying. But I translate it as effortless action when I translate it at all, because it really refers to the state where you're often very active. So you're a very successful diplomat or you're a successful butcher. So in the Zhuangzi, there's the story of the butcher. But what's crucial is you're experiencing your actions as natural and spontaneous and in a way not caused by you. So there's a strong feeling that you're not the agent. Either some other force is moving you or the world is moving you along. So there's this loss of a sense of agency and a loss of sense of self-consciousness. You're not thinking about yourself. You're not reflecting on what you're doing. And yet you're very successful. So that's this idea of effortless action. And then people who are in the state of Wu-Wei have this power that's usually translated as virtue with a capital V, this word duh. But I think charisma or even power is maybe better. But this is it's kind of aura that you kick off when you're in Wu-Wei. It makes people, if you're a Confucian ruler, it's what makes people want to follow you without you having to coerce them. They just naturally want to obey you. If you're a Taoist, it's what allows you, like if you're Zhuangzi, it's what allows you to move through the world efficiently, and kind of people are relaxed around you and they don't try to harm you, and you make them more relaxed, and then they are nicer to other people. It's a kind of social power that you acquire when you're in the state of Wu-Wei. And as I said, in the early Chinese context, there's a religious story about why these go together. So if you're in Wu-Wei, you're following heaven's will. So this anthropomorphic being, heaven, who's kind of in charge of the universe. And so heaven gives you duh as a reward. It's essentially a way for heaven to say, hey, this is somebody who's following me. So, you should follow them too, or you should be nice to them. So that's a religious story. So the modern equivalents I talk about where you see these two going together are things like, one example I use is dating, right? If you're trying to get a date, you're not going to get a date. You kick off this energy, it's got a desperate energy, and you're not attractive. And as soon as you stop trying, suddenly people are coming out of the woodwork and you're like, where were you when I was trying to find a date? But they were there, they just weren't attracted to you because you didn't have duh. So duh is the charisma you have when you're just kind of confident and happy and you're not trying to meet anyone. That's when people are attracted to you. Same thing, job interview, you're doing, or you're pitching an idea to some investors, let's say. If you're trying to get them to believe in this thing, you're going to be, you'll have anti-duh. You'll seem desperate. You'll seem like you're trying too hard, and people are not going to like the idea. What people like is hearing something from someone who's compelling and attractive at some level, attractive intellectually or whatever, because they just are so obviously confident and sure about what they're talking about. It gives you a kind of sense of confidence and wanting to work with them and trust them. And so I argued that these two things go together in our minds. And the reason for that has to do with our worries about interacting with people who are bullshitting us, like people who are pretending to be something that they're not, or people who are pretending to believe something that they don't really believe in. This is a real problem in large scale societies, and it has to do with a lot of these cooperation dilemmas you need to solve to work together effectively. And so once you realize that these two things go together, spontaneity and charisma, and you realize the types of situations where it's important that they go together, you can see how exerting more effort can be really counterproductive. Like trying too hard in an investor pitch or trying too hard to pick up someone at a bar is just not going to work. It's going to actually produce the opposite. And that's an important insight. And everyone, when you point this out to people, they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But again, I think because we don't have words for these things, we don't notice it as much as we should.
And can I ask, how are those two concepts related to this idea of the Tao or the Way, which I think is more familiar to our listeners? Yeah, what's the relationship between those three things?
So when you're in Wu-Wei, you're following the Tao. So that's how you get into Wu-Wei, is because you, like for Zhuangzi, you can actually almost see the Tao in the world. It means path or way, right? So if you're a Zhuangzian sage, you empty your mind of preconceptions, language, linguistic distinctions, and you make yourself open, and then you actually see the way in front of you. Everything you do is the right way, is following the way, because you can see you almost moved inexorably in that direction. That's the relationship, and that's why you get duh, because the way is created by heaven, and so once you're following the way, you're doing what heaven wants you to do, and heaven gives you this power.
Could you describe the four thinkers you bring forth in the book and their approaches to get into Wu-Wei?
Yeah, so one of the things I argue in the book is that this is a great ideal, right? We'd all like to be spontaneous. We'd all like to have charisma, and yet we also recognize that if we're not confident, if we're not happy, it's really hard to pull that off. Like, how do you make yourself on command be confident when you need confidence? And so this is the tension of, this is the paradox of how do you try not to try, right? So the goal is to be spontaneous, but you're not spontaneous right now. So how do you consciously try to be spontaneous? And I argue, so in my academic work, in my dissertation, I argued that this tension, I call it the paradox of Wu-Wei, there is actually the driving force in early Chinese philosophy. So one way to tell a narrative of what's going on in the Warring States is people coming up with what they think is a solution to the paradox. But there is no solution because it is a real paradox. And so the next person comes along and says, oh no, that's not going to work. And so that's basically the story I tell in the book when I'm laying out these strategies. So you've got Confucius, and Shun's at the end of the Warring States has really got a similar idea, which is try really hard. And if you do that for long enough, the trying will somehow fall away and you'll be spontaneous. Part of my argument as well is that this fits certain types of barriers to spontaneity. So if you're a tennis player, if you were a serious tennis player, right, you're not going to get good at serving unless you just do it a million times, right? You train it over and over again, but then eventually you get to a point, ideally, where it does become spontaneous and you are doing it without thinking about the various components or how to grip your racket or how you're supposed to put your arm back. And that's when you become like a Confucian gentleman. That's when you can play in an Wu-Wei fashion, but only because you've taken all this time to internalize these skills. And so there are certain types of spontaneity that you really can't get into without this Confucian, I call it the carving and polishing strategy. So it's working really hard for a long time. But the problem with that when it comes to things like what we really care about if we're Confucians is morality, right? You want to become a kind, let's say you want to become a more generous person. The way the paradox rears its head in this situation is you can see how if you practice your tennis serve 100 times, you'll get better at your tennis serve. It's hard to know if I'm not a generous person and I say, okay, I want to be generous, and I force myself to, let's say, give money to a homeless person I pass on my way to work. So I say, okay, I'm going to try to be generous. I'm going to start giving money to this homeless person. It's hard to see how forcing myself to do that repeatedly is ever going to make me actually a genuinely generous person. It could actually end up making me kind of resentful eventually, like, I got to give money to this guy again. And so this is where the first Taoist thinker, Laozi, comes in. And I'm going to say his, it was probably a group of people who wrote this text, but it's easier to just call him Laozi. His worry is that trying to be moral is going to turn you into a hypocrite. It's going to turn you into a kind of a faker. And so for him, you've got to do the opposite of the carving and polishing. You need to be, he's the most kind of extreme return to nature person, sense that. So against the carving and polishing, he says, let's be like the uncarved block. Let's go back to being simple like a child before we grew up. Let's go back to the state of nature, because he's got this faith that we were moral, spontaneously moral and good in the state of nature. And it's civilization and trying that screwed us up. And we need to get back to this simple state. And so for him, it's about forgetting and going back and undoing all this training that you've had. So, and then you've got Mencius, and arguably Mencius is trying to combine the two. So he's saying, yeah, human nature is good. So that's his famous slogan. But what he means by that is we have these potentialities for good. So basically we have the potentialities of Wu-Wei inside of us, but they're not going to grow themselves. They're like agricultural sprouts, not like weeds. So you need to water, you need to weed, you need to tend to them, but you also can't force it. So you can't try to make it happen faster than it's going to happen. And so he uses these agricultural metaphors. So we have these moral sprouts that we're going to slowly grow over time. And so his Wu-Wei strategy is basically try to focus on the beginnings of spontaneity within you. And if you focus on them and try to strengthen them, that's how you become a morally good person. And so I think with the generosity thing, Confucius would say, force yourself to do this thing over and over again. You'll eventually start to feel it. Laozi would say, that's a terrible idea. It'll just turn you into a hypocrite. Stop trying and you'll realize that you're naturally generous if you can just kind of get in touch with your nature. Mencius says, well, we have these potentials to be generous in us, but they're not strong enough to really make us be generous in their natural state. We need to strengthen them. And so you need a teacher to help you. You need to reflect on. So he would say something like, when you go by the homeless person and you don't give them money, how does it make you feel? Do you feel a little bad? Try giving them some money and then focus on how that made you feel. Did it give you a good feeling? Did you think, oh, I'm a better person for doing that? That's the mention strategy. You kind of have to identify the beginnings of the potentialities within you of spontaneity, and by focusing on them, you can make them stronger. So he's trying to really combine in some ways the Taoist Confucian strategies. He calls himself a Confucian, but he's a really funny kind of Confucian. and then there's Zhuangzi, the second Taoist thinker I look at, who basically says stop even trying worrying about trying or not trying. Like he thinks the problem with Lao Tzu is that Lao Tzu's got a strategy. Lao Tzu says stop doing this, stop doing that, stop doing this. And Zhuangzi thinks that that's even a kind of too much goal directed type of behavior. What you really need to do is make your mind empty. He has this, again, it's kind of faith. He has this faith that if you do that, the world will reveal itself to you as it really is. The Tao will reveal itself to you, and then you'll just know spontaneously what the right way to move is. And you'll never know from one moment to the next what the right thing to do is because you can't, the world is too complicated. So the metaphor he uses is you make your mind like a mirror so that you're responding to what's in front of you and you're always doing the right thing because you're not imposing your own ideas about the world onto the world. And so the Zhuangzian strategy is basically let yourself be guided by the world instead of by your own goals. And what I argue is, first of all, it's a real paradox. So I talk about the cognitive scientific groundings of the paradox, which is pretty simple. It's that when you're trying not to try, you're activating the part of your mind that you're actually trying to shut down. So it's like when you say to someone, don't think of a white bear. You have to think of a white bear because I've just activated that idea in your mind. So it's the same thing when you're when you say try to be spontaneous or try to be charming, you're actually activating the part of your brain that's going to interfere with your ability to really be charming or be spontaneous. And so the fact that it's a paradox just falls out of the nature of the way our minds are put together. So that's why there's no 100% solution to the problem, because it wouldn't be a paradox if there was some simple solution. And so what there really are is just pragmatic workaround strategies. And that's what these four strategies are, I think. And there's a reason that none of them ever won. So they basically, if you look at the history of Chinese thought, it's just people recycling one of these four strategies. So I think you could tell the whole, and other religious traditions. I mean, this is not just in China. Any tradition, like in the ancient West before the Enlightenment, people had something like Wu-Wei as an ideal. So Aristotle and the medieval Christian thinkers, and they're really just picking one of these four basic strategies, I think. And it's because there's a limited number of ways you can respond to this paradox, and they each have their own strengths. And so when I present each strategy, I also present the types of problems for which they're probably helpful, and also, the cognitive scientific, social psychological evidence for why these strategies would be helpful in these particular types of situations. So I think that the reason none of the strategies ever wins out is because none of them is a silver bullet. You need to know when to use which strategy.
And that's something I've been trying to do ever since I read your book. It's funny when you were talking about how the four different thinkers would approach this like homeless man on the street. I've been having these conversations in my head where there's like these four thinkers. All right, which one should I use and in which situation and what approach would help? And I reflect on my own experience as well. And I'm wondering, for someone like you who lives the life of the mind and writes so much, like I'm curious to know how you apply these thinkers to, say, something like your writing process, which is, I consider to be a very creative Wu-Wei type of exercise. Do you ever have, Confucius sitting on your right shoulder and Zhuangzi on your left shoulder, and, obviously some of the principles you take from cognitive science as well, like wandering or incubation, which I saw in one of your videos. Because I'm just really curious, how you apply these to your creative life.
Right. Sometimes when I'm writing and I'm not producing enough or I'm not producing what I want, the problem is I'm not trying hard enough. Sometimes I'm just not being disciplined enough. And the solution is just to sit down and frickin' write. Like make yourself sit in front of the computer and do something. And if that is the right response to the situation you're in, you'll know it pretty soon, because I find that what happens if I'm right about that is I'll force myself to sit down and I really won't want to. but within like 20 minutes, I'll be sucked into what I'm doing, and really, and I'll be in a way, I'll be absorbed into what I'm doing. But there are other times when that's actually not the problem. The problem is you've been trying too hard and you're stuck on something. And then if you keep trying, you're just going to either make it worse or just not make any progress at all. And that's when you really need to do more of a Taoist kind of either just let go, like just let go of it and go do something else, or a kind of Laozian forgetting where you say, maybe this whole the structure of this chapter, maybe it's all wrong. Maybe I should just get rid of everything, and start over again. Maybe the problem's coming because I thought I knew what this was supposed to look like, but it's not actually supposed to look like that. I should start all over again. So that's happened to me, and it's been useful to know when to step away. It's been useful to know when to go kayaking or like garden or do something else, because often you'll get your insights when you step away from the thing you've been attacking directly. And I, argue in the book and some talks I've given on this that one of the problems with modern life is that we don't allow incubation to happen. So because we're constantly bombarding our minds with information, we never get to just let our unconscious do its thing. And I see this with my students where they, when I was a student, at the very least, walking from class to class, you had some downtime. You went to Princeton, so you're walking from class to quad, you're looking at the stupid black squirrels climbing up trees, you're looking at...
They're not stupid, they're genetically modified and probably extremely intelligent, but yes.
Probably extremely intelligent. You're looking at something in this completely non-goal-oriented way, right? Your mind's wandering, you're just kind of relaxed. And that's super important for humans. Like, you need that time emotionally, but you also need it intellectually. And then things like sleep. Sleep is where your mind consolidates and connects all the stuff you learned during the day. And I look at my students now, and they don't have that downtime ever because they're walking from class to class, texting or looking at Facebook on their phone or whatever. I guess Facebook's not cool anymore. They're only old people my age do Facebook. So they're doing whatever is cool now, TikTok. They're doing something. They're taking in new information. And that means that it's like a fire hose. They have this constant fire hose flooding their brains with information, which means they never get a chance to process any of it or see deeper connections. And I really worry that this is going to have profound consequences on human creativity going forward. Our minds are built in such a way that we want information, and now we have the technology to provide information 24/7. And that turns out is not really good. And so, you need to do something. I really think people need to make an effort to unplug, make an effort to, you're on the bus, maybe don't look at your cell phone. Maybe just look out the window for half an hour, because that's when you can start, your mind's constantly trying to make connections, but it gets interfered with when it's getting too much input all the time. There's also the problem where your subconscious could figure out solutions to problems you're working on. But if you're constantly taking in information, you can't hear your unconscious. You maybe have the answer that you want already. It's just you can't hear it because your unconscious keeps trying to tell you, but you're, watching videos on YouTube. And if you had just shut up and gone for a walk, at some point that would break through to your conscious mind, and you'd be like, oh, right, that's the way to solve this problem or deal with this social situation I'm dealing with. And so one takeaway from the book is just that the constant stimulation of our minds that we have, and especially now with smartphones and being connected all the time, is unhealthy. And so we probably have to come up with really conscious strategies for limiting the amount of time we spend plugged into that stuff.
I did some extreme experiments. So when I eat, for example, I just try to eat and be present with my food, because that's a trigger, right? And I'm not going to look at my phone. Like no matter what, I'm just going to enjoy this meal, unplug, just focus on the food. And I've even done stuff like I spent 3 days doing nothing. I tried to. So I did the ultimate Laozi where I just said, Dad, I'm not going to work. I'm not even going to think about work or chill out in modern terms, which is like, yeah, being on your phone or like watching Netflix or something. I'm just going to do nothing, literally do nothing.
Okay. How did that go for you?
So I go to the coffee shop and I'm staring at a tree.
Yeah.
And
people probably call the police, right? They're like, there's something wrong with this guy. He's
what
on
is up with this
Yeah.
guy? He's just like, is he comatose
Yeah.
or what? But
yeah.
it was actually quite invigorating, I have to say. And I think that spending these afternoons without our phones or just giving yourself the freedom to do nothing, take that Lao-Tzu approach, like it really does help clear your mind.
It helps clear your mind, and it also gives your mind time to do important work.
Yeah. It's just going on in the background, right? But and then you can, I did notice I could hear myself better, exactly what you're saying. And something else I wanted to ask you about is like this idea of Wu-Wei that you mentioned is very much tied to being a part of something greater, or if you're doing something you really like to do or something you really value, it helps to enter this state of Wu-Wei. And I'm wondering if that has sort of implications for, career design for us. I believe that I'm most effective when I'm in Wu-Wei, when I'm dancing salsa or playing tennis. Similarly with work, I want to be in that state most of the time. I think it'd be hard to be in that state all the time, but if I'm in that space, man, I'm super effective. So if we could design our workday and our careers around Wu-Wei, I think it's really powerful.
So it has to do with how you motivate people, right? So disembodied rationality way to motivate people is through reward and punishment. So you give people external incentives, and then they're going to change their behavior to accord with those. The Wu-Wei perspective is arguing that the way to motivate people is to give them new internal motivations. To get them, you're going to be most effective not when you're focusing on some external goal. So if you want to use a dating situation, if you have this external goal of getting a date, you're going to look forced. You're going to sound like you're trying too hard. You're going to be unattractive. If you have a more internal goal, like, I just want to have fun and talk about interesting things with people because that's what I'm in the mood to do, then you will get a date. But it's because you're not consciously pursuing the goal. You're actually just absorbed in the activity. And so that, I think, relates to work, right? If you give people projects or you involve them in things that they really care about, they'll not only be better at it, right? They'll be more productive. They'll be happier. They'll be more creative. And that's, but it's tricky in a modern workplace to figure out how to do that, right? It's easier in academics because, we create our own goals, basically. It's harder to see how you do that if you ran a business that was producing widgets. And, you have to figure out ways that people could come to internally embrace at least some sub goals related to widget production or the selling or transport of widgets, right? You'd have to get people somehow excited about some aspect of that to get them into that state of Wu-Wei. But yeah, that's the crucial thing. So that's how Wu-Wei is related to the Tao, right? You're in Wu-Wei when you're in harmony with the Tao. And the Tao is, what matters. It's what gives meaning. It's kind of what makes things morally good. And I bring this idea up in the context of trying to explain how Wu-Wei as a concept is different from flow, right? This idea of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi of flow, where he thinks it's all about complexity and challenge and kind of ramping up complexity and challenge. But that doesn't actually fit his own research data. So when he and his colleagues asked people what gets you into flow, and they were one of the first people I think to do experience sampling. So where you give people like a little basically like a buzzer, and you just buzz them and you're like, right now, are you in flow or not? What were you doing? And what they find when they do that is that people experience flow in super low complexity situations. So they experience flow hanging out with their kids, walking in a park that they've walked in 100 times before. They experience it in situations where there's no challenge, there's no complexity, but the common thing is that they're absorbed into something that they value. So it's friends, it's people they love, it's kids, playing with kids. You play with a baby or something, there's no complexity, right? You're just doing like peekaboo 100 times. And yet it's you can get into Wu-Wei doing that because it's rewarding because of this kind of love you have for babies or especially your child, but it doesn't even have to be, right? There's kind of, I think people have a built-in kind of love of babies and children and or puppies just because puppies have evolved to piggyback on why we like kids. And so that's how you get into Wu-Wei is you get absorbed into something you care about. And so I think that innovative businesses, and I mean, I don't know that much about business, but I've spoken about this on a couple of Google campuses and noticed that just getting tours of, the way Google sets up their workplace, it does seem like they're, first of all, building in lots of unstructured opportunities. So there's lots of time to whatever, play foosball or do yoga or rock climb. And it's not because they're touchy feely, like we just want to make everyone happy. It's because they realize that they're dependent on creativity, and the way to foster creativity is to let people have this downtime and flexible time. And it seems like they try to put people in teams where they can actually get excited about a certain project or a certain idea and work toward that instead of being motivated by some external goals of like monthly sales or something. So I think these ideas are getting embraced in business in various ways. But part of the problem is if you don't have an overarching theory to explain why this is important, you're going to miss things, right? And so that's where I think the concepts like Wu-Wei are helpful, and the idea of the Tao and being absorbed in something that you care about is helpful because you can kind of figure out through trial and error that it's good to let people take a break and play foosball if they're having trouble figuring out a coding problem. But unless you understand why that is, you'll miss places where you should have been doing that. Or you'll screw up and give people too much time to play foosball. They'll actually become really unproductive. So you have to understand like why that downtime is important and what it's doing for you cognitively and intellectually.
I see like there's two things that kind of emerge from what we've been discussing in my mind. And one is being aware of when you could use a different approach, when you need to say, I'm going to sit my butt down in this chair and write for an hour. And when you say doing that would be very counterproductive. And that comes from through your own experience, really, right? Like just knowing from day to day, okay, that worked, that didn't work. It's very self-reflective, in my opinion. And the other thing that I find really interesting is this balance between work and play, this balance between effort and relaxation, I guess might be another way I kind of interpret it. Because I know when I'm playing my best tennis or dancing my best salsa, it's kind of like right in between.
Yeah, the state of Wu-Wei is weird cognitively because it's not effortless in the way that lying on a couch watching TV is, right? There's a feeling of effort. And so I talk about this. There's a really clever study of jazz pianists. They put them in fMRI machines and gave them these non-ferromagnetic keyboards so they can use them in the machine. And we're scanning them when they were doing kind of goal-directed and really structured tasks like playing scales or playing a pre-written piece. And then they would let them just improvise. So they were at a certain point, they said, just improvise. And what they saw when people were improvising was interesting because it's, the cognitive control regions of the brain downregulated as you'd expect. So that's what's giving you that feeling of, oh, I'm not really trying. But what's interesting is that one part of the cognitive control network, the system that is in charge of stuff, the ACC, so the anterior cingulate cortex. So this is basically kind of, it's what tells you when things are messed up. Like if you're doing something automatically and then it's not working, the ACC is the thing that says, hey, stop doing that. We need cognitive control because that's not working. What was interesting is that when they were improvising, the ACC was super active. So it was monitoring. So there's a kind of background attention that's going on that's quite intense when you're in these Wu-Wei states. So it's not zoning out, right? And it's not just being a couch potato. It's being engaged in a way that where you are deeply engaged, but you don't have that same feeling of effort, right? I'm a tennis player, and I'm a terrible tennis player because I learned as an adult, so I'm bad. But I've had the experience. I've gotten good enough now that at least every once in a while I have the experience of like hitting forehands where I'm not having to think about it. I'm just, I'm doing everything the way I'm supposed to. I'm setting up, I'm using my torso, I'm putting topspin on the ball. And it feels relaxed. I feel relaxed, but I'm also super attentive, right? I'm exerting, it's some kind of effort, right? But it is qualitatively different from the type of effort when I'm doing a lesson and I'm having a coach telling me, no, you gotta have a closed racket. And so that's Wu-Wei. It's that state of being, you feel relaxed and yet you're super engaged.
Yeah, you feel relaxed, you're super engaged. And when I'm in the zone on a tennis court, I'm just telling myself one word, like soft and hard or something, like making contact with the ball. But that is all I need to just stay in that place. Have you come across any research that talks about play in accessing this state?
Play is, the feeling of play, absorption, and even like Zhuangzi uses the word, arguably the word play to describe Wu-Wei. In classical Chinese, xiao yao you, the yo. It means it's in compounds that refer to play in modern Chinese, but that's what he doesn't use the word. He actually doesn't use the word Wu-Wei very often. He more often talks about play, because for him, that's Wu-Wei is that state where you're like cooking butcher ding when he's cutting up the ox. His blade is literally the yoing. It's playing in the space in between the ligaments and tendons, and so play is just that state. Is just another word for that state of way where you're interacting with the world in a way that's spontaneous, it's creative, it's self motivating. So it's not, you don't have to make people play, right? Play is rewarding in and of itself. It's got all the structures, and so play is just another way of getting at this state, I think, because it's got the same structure as in a way state.
Yeah, and you mentioned in one of your later chapters about how we trust people who are more spontaneous. And of course, you brought up the example of doing business in Asia, and I've been living in Asia for many years. And this idea that business is not done in the corporate office, but in the bars. When people are just drinking their faces off and showing their true colors, right? Is this kind of idea. They can't fake who they are. And that's why we like to get to know people through hobbies, right? Or like sports or board games or whatever it is. You can actually just see what they're really like in that state.
Yeah, it's actually the book I'm working on right now is about that topic. So it's about intoxication, mostly alcohol, but other types of intoxication, and why humans do it, which is actually, it seems like a dumb question, but it's actually puzzling from an evolutionary perspective why we like to get drunk, basically. What got me interested in it was that section of Trying Not to Try when I was talking about the role of drinking in business, right? So there's a reason when Skype was invented, everyone was like, oh, business travel will now cease, right? Because why would I fly to Shanghai to meet with these people and to sign a contract when we could just do it over Skype or email or whatever? And yet business travels remained completely unchanged. Like it didn't affect business travel at all. And there's a reason for that. It's because if you're going to sign a contract with people, especially in a situation where there's trust involved, and I actually think one of the reasons that drinking is more important in Asia, in Asian business culture, is partly because more is dependent on trust relationships, because less is contractually spelled out. I feel like business deals often involve kind of implicit, like, okay, we got to trust each other on this, or there's unspoken rules about how it's going to play out in ways that, Germans would want to write down. You don't always do that in China or in Vietnam. And so when you're in a situation that's more dependent on trust, you need to know that you have that trust. And that's going to then make you want to meet people. You're going to want to get them drunk. And so I talk about the why from a physiological, cognitive, scientific perspective, that makes sense, because lying or faking requires you to use your cognitive control regions. And alcohol is basically like paralyzing your prefrontal cortex, right? And so I use this analogy, I think in Try Not to Try, that it's you do a couple shots with someone. It's in the same way you shake hands to show that you're not carrying a weapon in your right hand. You do a few shots of Baijiu with somebody, and you're basically taking your prefrontal cortex out and putting it on the table. You're like, I've got no cognitive control anymore. And so the things I'm telling you are probably true because I've lost the ability to lie effectively. And so it's a chemical disarmament, and it allows you to then build trust. Or, sometimes people walk away, right? They go out drinking with somebody and they're like, you know what? I'm not going to do this deal. And it's because you got some weird vibe from them when they were drunk that made you think, they're bullshitting me about this, or maybe there's things going on I don't know about. So, and I think this is in ancient China, no treaty would get signed without these enormous banquets, but basically they were drinking parties. So the next book, the book I'm writing, I'm actually on chapter 1 right now, but I'm supposed to deliver this by sometime in the spring. It's called Drunk.
I love this title. I saw it in your CV. Drunk, Intoxication, Ecstasy, and the Origins of Civilization. Oh my gosh, what a title. Can I ask you one last question? Is there anything that you would have changed with the book now that it's been 5 years since you've written it?
Yeah. Well, some new social psychology research. So one big issue, and I'm going to have to go back and change this in my MOOC now at some point, is, I'm arguing that I talk a bit about the ego depletion literature. So the fact that the reason Wu-Wei is often the way we need to do things is because we have limited cognitive control resources. And this is now a super controversial topic in social psychology. So there's been massive meta-analyses and most recently a huge replication effort that are not showing the ego depletion effect. So people are now arguing that maybe ego depletion is not a thing. Maybe it's an artifact of just bad research practices or so that's something, if I wrote the book again, I'd have to really think about more. Everyone agrees that there's something to mental fatigue, right? No one denies that we get mentally fatigued, but it may be the case that we're wrong about the mechanisms and even the conditions under which it happens. So that's something that's changed in the psychology literature that I would have to revisit if I was going to rewrite this book again.
Your course is up on YouTube. You got a Facebook page. Yeah, where can we follow you, Edward?
I also have a Twitter account, so you can follow me on Twitter. I'm not a super prolific tweeter, but I do tweet out things that are interesting related to Wu-Wei or early Chinese thought, and no doubt we'll start putting out some stuff on intoxication soon. We
got to get you back on the podcast for that one once you finish the book. So thank you so much for your time, Edward. This has been a true delight, and been looking forward to this conversation for weeks. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Did you like this episode? Press subscribe, leave a review, and tell your friends about us. Do it! If you want to join the discussion for this episode, go head over to upstartist.tv/ace. That's ASE. You made it to the end of the episode. You're a survivor, and we're going to reward you with a little 1-minute ashe. Ashe is just a fancy way of saying ace. All right, this is just a thought to leave you with. Just carry it with you. You don't need to do anything. Just a parting thought, if you will. So Edward mentions Zhuangzi's approach of letting go to enter Wu-Wei, right? The next time, got a big problem, or the next time, even you're just catching dinner with your friends, just try letting go of all those labels. Let go of good, bad, right, wrong, should do, should not do. You're this, you're that, I'm this, I'm that. Just drop the labels. Drop the labels, drop the ideas of what it should be, of what it's supposed to be, of what you want it to be. And just be there. Just go with the flow. That's it. That's your 1-minute ashe. We'll see you next time on ACE.